Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be discussing the case of two college-aged sweethearts who, during a weekend they spent together at one of their respective schools, were brutally murdered. The details of the case are horrific, and trying to pin down who could have committed these heinous acts will have your head spinning. Today's episode is part 1 of the murders of William Sproat and Mary Petry. If you asked anyone who knew him to describe William Sproat, they'd probably first start off by telling you to call him either Bill or Willie, and then they'd tell you he was one of the kindest guys they knew. His father described him as mild-mannered, and his friends saw him as very serious and dedicated to his studies. He attended Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he obtained his bachelor's degree in French in 1969, and would later go on to participate in the graduate French program at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Bill was also described as a devout Catholic. Then there's Mary Petry. If you asked any of her friends or family to describe her, one of the first things that usually came to mind was how devoutly religious she was, but they'd also mention her vibrant personality and how incredibly smart she was, with her always making her way onto the dean's list each semester. And in terms of her intelligence and unwavering commitment to her studies, she was described as the best student in the Modern Languages department at Mount St. Joseph College in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she was working on her bachelor's degree in French. During the summer of 1968, Mary was just starting out in her college career, and she'd gotten the opportunity to spend that summer studying abroad in France, which was likely a bucket list item for her, especially considering her major in college. And a chance encounter with a friend of Bill Sproat's while away on this trip to France would spark a relationship that Mary likely never would have expected. This friend of Bill's appeared to like Mary enough to decide that when they got back from France, he was going to introduce her to his buddy Bill. So a few months after returning from their studies abroad, in October of 1968, this friend invited both Bill and Mary to a performance of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and after that first introduction, the two almost immediately started dating and became practically inseparable.
Am I right in thinking that this friend of Bill kind of felt shellacked, for, lack of a better term?
What do you mean?
So the friend of Bill meets Mary in France. Mm-hmm. They hit it off. They come back, and this friend invites Mary out with Bill.
I don't think it was like that. I think it was more of like, oh, you guys are both majoring in French, and, okay. I think you guys would really get along, and I think it was just like, my buddy Bill never dates, and Mary never dated, and it was like, you know what, let's just get them together and see if something blossoms from this, and it did.
So the friend was trying to make the connection there. The friend didn't bring Mary as like a date, and then Mary and Bill hit it off, and then they started dating.
No, it did not seem like that at all.
All right.
So the two clearly had a lot in common. They were both Catholics and were described as very religious. They were both majoring in French in college, and on top of that, they both were interested in teaching the French language at the college level after they graduated. The pair were smitten with each other from the moment they met, and both of their families supported their relationship. According to a piece in the Ohio State University publication The Lantern, written by Lewis Heldman, Mary's twin sister Martha stated of her family's fondness for Bill, quote, "All of us liked him very much. He was a very personable type guy. We're an extremely close-knit family, but when Bill came to dinner, he seemed to fit right in," end quote. There were also rumors that Bill and Mary had recently gotten engaged or were planning to get married at some point, but I haven't been able to nail down the accuracy of those statements. But in regards to the potential of marriage between the two, Mary's sister stated, quote, "I used to tease her about marrying Bill, and all she ever did was smile. But intuitively, I knew she had found someone she loved dearly," end quote.
I feel like it's fair to assume that if they had gotten engaged, with them both being devout Catholics, there probably would have been word spread about that because it would have been a big wedding at a church and stuff like that after the fact. So
yeah, I would think so. I wonder if
but
it
it
was
is an
more
old case.
Also true. I was wondering if it was more along the lines of like they'd talked about it and they were planning, like once Bill was done with the graduate program and once Mary was done with at least her bachelor's, maybe they were planning on something. But you still have to think they are pretty young, so
Kind of like an unspoken thing.
Yeah, it could have been something like that.
They're also young for today's standards, but back then, I mean, people were getting married and having kids early 20s. That was like the thing.
Yeah. Now, by June of 1969, Bill had graduated with his bachelor's from Xavier University and made the decision to join the graduate French program at Ohio State University, OSU for short, which was 110 miles away from Mount St. Joseph, where Mary was still studying. Regardless of the hour-and-a-half drive that would now be between them, the two continued to see each other often, with them each traveling to the other's respective city regularly for weekend visits. At some point during Bill's time at OSU, he rented an apartment with one of his childhood best friends, Thomas McGuigan. The two had known each other since first grade, and Thomas was participating in the graduate psychology program at the school. Their new home was located within an old 3-story building that had been converted into apartments, located at 178.5 West 8th Avenue in Columbus, Ohio, which was just under 2 miles from the OSU campus, and the two buddies lived in apartment C, which was a 2-bedroom unit and was located on the 2nd floor. The trouble with this new living arrangement, though, was that this area of Columbus was rife with crime, with the amount of assaults and rapes reported in the area being very high at the time, and there had also been 3 to 4 murders that took place in the neighborhood during the previous 2 years as well. But up until this point, it didn't appear as though Bill or Thomas had any issues with their particular apartment in this part of the city.
When I think Columbus, Ohio, even by today's standards, I think crime.
Probably because you think more like city?
Maybe, but yeah. Like if you were to say Columbus, Ohio, do you think it's still rife with crime? I would say probably most larger cities.
More so in the city area, I would think. And, you know, with this being like a college town and that kind of thing, like you can see why crime might be higher in an area like that.
Yeah, and also, like, just to put it into perspective of something that I'm familiar with, like Providence, you have PC.
Yep.
It's down in the city, and that is also an area where it's, you know, densely packed with college kids, but also there's some low-income housing. There's gangs that are set up around that area, and it is an area where, you know, you don't really want to be walking around at night by yourself.
No, I completely agree. And I feel like every state has a place like that.
Yeah, I would say.
Or multiple. I mean, Rhode Island, you know, we've got one big one, but
that sticks out, yeah. But I would say, yeah, probably most cities that have some type of college or university where you have, you know, a big group of housing units there for people to stay. I mean, broke college kids don't have a ton of money to buy their own house, so they're going to look for the cheapest place to stay.
Yep. And I will say this area, too, like I had mentioned that their building had been converted into an apartment building. And I guess there were tons of old buildings in this area that was done to pretty much most of the buildings there. So you had the majority, like young people, college kids, you know, people that have less income, those kinds of things. You were finding that in this area. So
Right. And it's no secret that with lower income housing areas, people that are struggling to make ends meet, crime kind of congregates in those areas more so than, you know, wealthier areas.
Yeah, so unfortunately.
You have broke college students, people of the age, you know, where I would say if you pulled up a statistic, I wouldn't be surprised where most crime is perpetrated by people from the age of 16 to 30.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised
in that area,
by that either. So. Now, by February of 1970, Bill, who was 23 years old at the time, was still working through the graduate program at OSU, while Mary, who was 20 years old, was in her junior year of her studies at Mount St. Joseph and lived in the dorms there. During the weekend of February 27th, 1970, Bill was originally supposed to make a trip to Cincinnati to visit with Mary, as the pair usually would. However, for one reason or another, Bill wasn't going to be able to make it. And I say for one reason or another because I've seen 2 different scenarios reported. One, that Bill's car broke down and he was unable to drive to see Mary, and 2, that he had a paper to write that weekend and wanted to stay in Columbus to get it done. I've seen the latter reported more frequently, so that's what I tend to believe is more accurate, but I just wanted to make that discrepancy known. Plus, it was also reported in an article in The Lantern that Bill's best friend, Donald Dawson, said Bill had convinced Mary to come to Columbus instead of him going to her due to him needing to write this paper. But despite the last-minute change of plans, Mary wasn't going to let that stop her from spending the weekend with her boyfriend, so she'd need to figure out a way to get there. And when she heard that several people at Mount St. Joseph were planning to drive up to Columbus that night, she capitalized on that and carpooled with those other students. Once Mary arrived in Columbus, she checked into a Holiday Inn located in the same city. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly which Holiday Inn she checked into due to the fact that today there are a multitude of the chain in the area, but you would assume the hotel wasn't all that far from Bill's apartment. Now, you might be wondering why Mary would be staying in a hotel and not at Bill's apartment, but I think that decision goes back to their religion and the fact that the two were not married. I don't know for sure that this was the reason, but it's an educated guess I'm making based on what I know about the Catholic religion.
I'd say that's pretty fair.
I would say so too, and it's what a lot of people speculate about online too, to say, you know, if they were so devoutly religious, they likely were not going to be sleeping in the same place, never mind the same bed.
Right.
So it makes sense that she would get a hotel room instead.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, you have Bill living with a roommate.
Yes, very true.
So Who knows? I mean, just out of courtesy, maybe he didn't want to have her staying over, kind of stepping on his roommate's toes.
Yeah, well, we're about to dive into it in a second, but Thomas wasn't home that night, so he didn't really have anything to worry about, at least on Friday. Mm-hmm. But either way, I think it just goes back to, you know, their religion and their decision to, you know, sleep separately. So
I think you're accurate in that.
So anyway, after Mary checked in and got all her stuff situated in her room, she made a phone call to her brother, and then after that, she hopped into a cab and headed towards Bill's apartment. From all accounts, Mary arrived to Bill's place at approximately 6 p.m. the night of February 27th, and the cab driver even waited to watch Mary walk into the building. Now, fast forward about 18 hours later to noontime on Saturday, February 28th. Thomas, Bill's roommate, was returning home from a night spent at a friend's place, and when he arrived to the door of his apartment on the second floor, he noticed that the door had been left open, and it was specifically reported to be, quote, 3/4 open. After Thomas pushed the door open the rest of the way and walked into the apartment, he was met with a scene that no one could ever imagine witnessing. Both Bill and Mary were dead, and the scene Thomas had been met with was absolutely horrific. The Columbus PD were then dispatched to 178.5 West 8th Avenue right away and arrived to find the gruesome scene that Thomas had just walked in on. As investigators worked their way through the residence, they located Bill Sproat on the floor of the bathroom, hog-tied with his wrists tied to his ankles behind his back with wire coat hangers. He'd been stabbed repeatedly in the back, strangled, gagged with a piece of cloth, and potentially also hit in the head with an object. Meanwhile, Mary was found lying on the bed in what I believe was Bill's bedroom. She was said to be only partially clothed and was nude from the waist down. It was believed that she could have been sexually assaulted due to this discovery. Mary, similarly to Bill, had also been stabbed multiple times in the back, but not only that, her skull had been crushed. The scene was nightmarish, and initially, the way in which it was described by investigators was, quote, blood-spattered and terribly, terribly gory. End quote.
I mean, that's horrific to walk into, especially, I mean, you have police walking into it on one hand after they've been called. But I mean, it's one of those things where it's part of the job where you know that you're going to deal with terrifying things.
Yep.
Still not something you want to see. But then you have Thomas walking in, seeing the door open, probably knowing that something's wrong there.
Yep.
And then finding his friend and his friend's fiance or girlfriend.
Yep.
Totally like
someone he's known since he was like 9.
Right.
I mean,
I don't even have the words for it as far as like how disgusting this scene probably was
in
more ways than one.
It's so brutal. Like, it just seems like so much anger, and there's a lot, which we'll, you know, continue to work through as we discuss the rest of the case. But I do know that they had originally tried to interview Thomas and like question him and ask him.
He's probably in shock.
He was completely in shock, like could barely even provide, I think they said, a coherent story.
That's like a life-ruining event for somebody.
Oh my God, I can only imagine like what he must have dealt with after seeing that. But then you think on the other hand, like, holy crap, like somebody did this to 2 people, and these brutal acts that were done to these young co-eds, like that is just the best word to use to describe it is horrific. It's horrible.
Yeah, I think when you were telling me about it, I got Gainesville Ripper vibes. Just to make a connection to another case that we had done before.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, you don't think that one person was capable of doing this either. I don't know. It's just a terrible thing to hear, and you were right in saying that this is a brutal case.
Yeah, so as we continue on with this case, we're going to take our discussion of the investigation through several categories, as per usual. And I do just want to say that there is a lot when it comes to the scene, what was found there, what wasn't, the autopsy findings, and then all of the discrepancies within each of those categories, because there seem to be a lot.
Did I make mention that I think that this had to be done by more than one person?
You did, yes.
Okay.
Which I find to be interesting that you say. I don't discount that, but I think based on some of the things that we'll find out in a little bit and some of the things that police said, you might change your mind or you might completely disagree with them. So we'll see kind of where you land. But
right. I mean, maybe premature in thinking that, but unless, they were held at gunpoint and under duress and, this person told Mary to hogtie Bill while he has them at gunpoint or something like that. I don't know. Let's continue on. I'm sure there is a ton of stuff to go through.
Oh, there is. All right, so we'll begin with the apartment itself and everything that was found or not found within it. First and foremost, as we already know, the door was left open for the most part, but authorities did confirm publicly that there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment. So that could lead you to believe that either Bill or Mary knew the person who came to the door and they let them in willingly, or maybe they just kept their door unlocked, but who knows?
Or somebody could have followed them in while they were entering the apartment.
Yeah, that would make sense. Now, when walking into the apartment through the front door, the unit itself overall appeared to be in relatively normal condition. Nothing was really out of place, it wasn't ransacked, and it didn't appear as though anything was stolen. And Lieutenant Robert Ruddock with the Columbus PD, who was heading up this investigation, along with 18 other assigned detectives, stated of the condition of the unit, quote, "There wasn't any great struggle. The apartment was not torn up," end quote. Another comment made by investigators was that they didn't feel as though Bill or Mary put up any sort of a fight with their attacker. And from what I can tell based on my research, neither individual had defensive wounds, and I think that, coupled with the lack of a struggle seen within the apartment, led authorities to that assumption.
Okay, so just spitballing here and trying to imagine something where how can this happen to these two people? No defensive wounds, doesn't seem like there was a struggle or anything. That goes back to, one person coming in with a gun, telling Mary to hogtie Bill. Then Bill is pretty much out of commission. Then maybe this person, cracks her on the head. I don't know to what extent the damage was to her skull, but if they're saying her skull was crushed, I mean, you got to assume that it was some type of huge, heavy object. And you would assume that it probably wasn't done on the bed.
That I'm not 100% sure on, but we will cover, the details of that, at least the ones that, the public was made aware of. But I see what you're saying.
If you have Mary hog-tying Bill and gagging him, he can't make any noise, and now he's hog-tied. He can't really defend her or himself. Then Mary gets taken advantage of, whether she's smacked in the head, so she's unconscious, she can't defend herself. We don't know if there was a sexual assault that took place. But then after that, you have the stabbing. So she could have been knocked unconscious already. They want to make sure that she's dead. They stab her multiple times. Then after they're done with her, they go into the bathroom. They stab Bill multiple times, and they choke him to make sure that he dies.
Well, there's more details here that I think might start to put this story together better for you. So let's keep going.
All right.
So there were, in the apartment, two things that did appear to be either missing or out of place. The first was a chair that had been moved. Specifically, it was described as, quote, "A stuffed chair had been pushed against one wall, holding the window curtain shut," end quote. And I do believe this chair was in the bedroom where Mary's body was found and was used to hold those curtains closed. And I personally feel as though this was something that was done strategically by the killer due to the fact that the bedrooms in Bill and Thomas's apartment faced the street.
Right, and you're thinking, this is a city, you have a lot of different housing units around. If there's light on in the apartment and somebody sees from across the street, they can be a witness to this and they can call police while it's occurring. So this is clearly the killer trying to go totally unnoticed.
Exactly. Now, in regards to the one missing item, the description of that was provided by Thomas, Bill's roommate. He said the one thing he could tell that was missing was a rug, which I think was originally in the living room of the apartment, but I'm not 100% sure on that fact. It was described as either a 2x4 or 3x5 foot gold throw rug with tassels along the edges. Outside of that, the only other thing that was said to be missing was some money from inside both Bill and Mary's wallets. It appeared as though whatever money they had in them was taken and their empty wallets left behind in the apartment, with Mary's being left near her body, but I'm unsure of where Bill's empty wallet was left, but it was found in the apartment. Either way, friends and family of the two co-eds did state that neither Bill nor Mary were the types to carry large amounts of cash on them. And due to this, as well as other factors brought to investigators' attention at the scene, they didn't believe that robbery was necessarily the motive at this point. It seemed like taking the money may have been more of an afterthought, and authorities were thinking more along the lines that the motive was potentially sexual in nature due to the original assumption that Mary had been sexually assaulted. But since it was still so early on in the investigation, authorities couldn't really rule anything in or out just yet.
I think the reason that they're probably trying to rule out robbery as being the initial motive is because the place wasn't ransacked.
Exactly.
And it seems like these two were targeted for a reason. And if they don't look wealthy, I mean, they're co-eds, why would you think that they're carrying large sums of cash? It does seem somewhat like an afterthought, but I mean, you just murdered these two people. Why not look for money?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what police were thinking, but that it wasn't like the initial thought in the perpetrator's mind to say, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to steal the money from their wallets and then I'll kill them.
No, it seems like I'm going to punish these two people for whatever reason. I'm going to sexually assault this female while her boyfriend watches and then kill them both or something.
Yeah, that seems more along the lines of what the killer might have been thinking, not like, I'm going to go in and steal money. That just doesn't jive for me.
No. Based on what they were able to do to these two individuals, they very easily could have just robbed them.
Yeah.
And not killed them. So.
And there were lots of robberies happening in the area too, so it's not like that was out of the ordinary, but clearly this murder and this level of brutality along with it was something that just did not happen in the area.
Right.
Now, continuing on with the scene and what was located there, the biggest things authorities were able to find still at the apartment, which one might have expected the killer to take with them, especially considering there was a rug missing, but they found the murder weapons, which I personally found to be quite strange. Again, considering the whole situation with the rug, like why take the rug but leave the murder weapons behind? It's so random to me, but either way, there were 2 murder weapons, and both were found in the apartment. And before we discuss what those murder weapons were, I do just want to mention that at first, authorities were keeping the info that the weapons were found close to the chest, but they did eventually release the fact that they'd located them and described exactly what they were. So, we know that Bill and Mary had both been stabbed in the back, but Mary's skull had also been crushed. In terms of what you'd expect the murder weapon to be in terms of the stab wounds, you'd likely think a knife, and that's exactly what authorities located. It was said to be a butcher knife with a 7.5-inch blade, and the knife came from the knife block set that Bill and Thomas had in their apartment, so this was not a weapon that the killer brought with them. Now, in terms of where the knife was located in the unit, like after it had been used, that I'm not entirely sure of, and I also don't know what type of physical evidence authorities may have gotten off of it, specifically due to one fact. And that's that authorities believed that the rug that was taken from the apartment was used to wipe off the murder weapons.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I would have thought, like, obviously outside of wiping down the murder weapon, which is what you just said authorities believed it may have been used for, I was thinking perhaps a sexual assault, if it did take place, maybe it took place on the rug. And
could there have been
DNA or whatever transferred over there? But I mean, were criminals thinking about DNA in 70?
Yeah, see, I don't think so, but you would think wiping off the murder weapons, they would think that they're wiping off any prints. But then why not just take it with you?
Right.
If you're taking the rug already, why are you...
Wrap it up in the rug and take it all together.
Yeah, so I just thought it was very strange that they were like, no, we think that they used this. So based on these comments about wiping off the weapons with the rug, I would think that there probably wasn't a lot of anything found on the knife, and maybe they just left it behind because they were like, oh, I wiped off my prints, big deal. I still think it's kind of dumb, but...
Why wouldn't they put it back in the block?
Exactly.
Wipe it off, put it back in the block, now they don't know what it is.
Very true, good point. And I also find it to be really bizarre that if this is what the killer did, why use a rug? Like, you couldn't find a towel, a paper towel, a shirt, someone else's piece of clothing, literally anything else in the apartment. why a rug? And John, I feel like what you said about the potential of maybe a sexual assault having occurred on the rug, or maybe he was sitting on the rug or something, like he felt as though he had something of himself on the rug.
Maybe he bled on the rug somehow?
Maybe, yeah, that's possible too.
I understand how authorities are saying that they believe the killer may have used the rug to clean off the murder weapons. But the only way I think that you can like definitively say that is if you found like fibers of the rug on the murder weapon. Because he very well could have used a shirt. He very well could have used anything else to clean off these murder weapons and then just taken the rug because he thought that he left some type of evidence on there.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, for sure.
But the rug missing is interesting.
Of all things, the whole apartment, it's just the rug.
Yeah, strange.
It is. So authorities were putting a lot of stock into this rug because obviously they're thinking he wiped off the murder weapons with it. They were probably thinking other things that they could gather from that rug if they were to find it. And they were hoping they would be able to get additional clues that could point them towards who did this. And they even spent the Monday after the murders, which was the OSU campus area garbage pickup day, scrutinizing all the trash that was being picked up. And they thought they would be able to locate this rug within someone's trash in the area, but unfortunately came up empty in those efforts. However, since we're on the topic of the rug now, I figured I would bring it up. Authorities did end up locating it about 3 weeks after Mary and Bill were killed.
Okay. That just like blows my mind because I'm thinking you take this rug, it's obviously a flammable item. It's potential evidence in a crime scene that you just took part in. Burn the shit. Like I think about like, I don't know, I always reference movies and stuff, but whatever. Batman Begins, you think of Gotham, you have like these homeless people huddled around a large metal trash bin with a fire lit in it. And I remember Bruce Wayne in Batman Begins takes a bunch of his stuff and like throws it into that fire, gives his jacket to one of the homeless guys or whatever.
Yep.
But I'm like, if you take this piece of evidence that is very easily destroyed, why are you taking it but then leaving it behind somewhere?
And you're just going to get a kick out of where this was found too. So it was said to be located on a bakery truck that had been abandoned in an alley that was only about 8 blocks from Bill and Thomas's apartment.
That's so wild. I don't get it.
Like, why? Why ditch it there?
I mean, the only other question I was going to ask you was like, could this rug, is this like an Oriental rug that's valuable?
I don't think so.
Clearly not if it was left behind. I mean, what would these 2 college guys be doing with, you know, like $1,000 Oriental rug in their house?
Exactly. And it was a small rug, too. They said it was gold with some tassels on the edges. Like, it sounds like something you'd probably pick up at Job Lot as a dude who's living in, like, his bachelor pad. You know what I mean?
Or take it from the family.
And I say Job Lot, I bet everybody listening is like, what in the hell is a Job Lot?
Ocean State Job Lot.
Correct. But it was confirmed to definitely be the rug that authorities were looking for pretty much right after they located it due to it being completely blood-stained. And after they tested the blood, it was confirmed that the type matched that of Mary's. Unfortunately, though, it didn't appear as though anything came from the discovery of the rug in terms of tracking down Bill and Mary's killer.
Yeah, I'm so lost on that. Like, okay, I get it. You take it. But then why is it found so close by, just abandoned?
Yeah, I mean, I have no explanation, and spoiler alert for everybody listening, I have no idea what to even make of this case. This is probably the most confusing one I have researched in a hot minute. I
mean, I guess if you're thinking about, like, how would this person have it on them and then get rid of it?
Right, he's going to tuck it into his back pocket as he walks out of the apartment? Like, what are you doing with this rug?
That's not what I was saying. I was saying, you have this person, they have it in their possession.
Okay.
They leave the crime scene, and then they're in this alleyway or whatever. What reason could they have had to just leave it behind? I'm wondering, was there a police patrol in the area? Were they worried that somebody was going to see them with it? And they were like, shit, I got to ditch it. And then this cop comes up to him and is like, oh, what are you doing back here?
But wouldn't you think like he's probably covered in blood already from this crime? Like if it was right
carrying
after.
around a blood-soaked rug?
Exactly. So I don't know. I have no possible explanation for that.
Do we have any more information about where that rug was found? I know you said abandoned on a bakery truck. Was there anything else, you know, characteristic of that area, like a lot of crime in that one spot?
I mean, it was 8 blocks from the apartment, so I mean, still within a high crime area, but no, I mean, there really wasn't much. And, you know, they put all this stock into this rug, and for the first 3 weeks, you know, it's mentioned in like every article, oh, authorities are looking for the rug. They're checking the campus, they're checking the local area, they're looking through everyone's trash, and then miraculously 3 weeks later, it just turns up in this random alley?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm lost.
It's just so confusing.
Yeah, I'm at a loss for words on that one.
Yeah.
So let's keep going because I'm sure there's a lot more.
Oh, there is. So the second murder weapon, which was the item used to crush Mary's skull, was something I was totally shocked by when I first began researching this case. And John, you were sitting in the same room with me while I was researching this, and I was like, oh my God, like, what? This is just so bizarre. Mm-hmm. And I wanted desperately in that moment to tell you what this weapon was, but for the sake of John's reactions being genuine on the podcast, I bit my tongue. So now I can tell you that the murder weapon used to crush Mary's skull was a bowling ball.
A bowling ball?
Correct. And that bowling ball was found in the same room, pretty much left right next to Mary's body. And based on comments from authorities at the time, it appeared as though the bowling ball somehow had indications on it that it was used to crush Mary's skull, which was kind of a surprising comment to me because investigators had mentioned that the killer had wiped off the murder weapons, right, plural. So maybe not entirely, but...
You had mentioned that the knife came from the apartment. I assume the bowling ball did not.
I think it might have. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm 99% sure.
So it's either Thomas's or Bill's bowling
ball? I believe
ball?
So, yeah. So there was clarification, too, on how this bowling ball was used in the attack, because at first I was like, this is such an awkward object to use to murder someone. So according to a piece written by Lacey McCrary for the Akron Beacon Journal, quote, it was a bowling ball, the type used in bowling supply stores to measure customers for bowling balls. It was full of holes. An old crutch had been forced into one of the holes, making a good handle for someone who wanted to use it as a weapon, end quote.
So essentially turning it into like a super heavy mace.
I guess, yeah.
Also, I'm wondering, I mean, I've never been to a bowling supply shop, but is a bowling ball that's used to measure people's fingers as heavy as a normal bowling ball? Obviously, I know there's different sizes and weights and stuff to them, but...
That I have absolutely no idea. Anybody listening, if you work in some sort of bowling-related industry, or you know, or are a bowler, or work at, I would assume, like some sort of sporting goods store or something like that, let us know. I'm definitely curious about that.
Strange.
Yeah. Very obscure object. I feel like there are a multitude of different things that could have been used. So when I saw that it was a bowling ball, I'm like...
But it's never been put out whether or not that bowling ball was Thomas's or Bill's?
No, I don't know who it belonged to, but I'm pretty sure, like pretty sure that it was in the apartment. But okay. I don't know. You know, and that's the thing with these older, like less publicized cases. For all I know, like maybe Bill was an avid bowler and, you know, this was normal for him.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking 50-something years ago now, yeah.
So I'm not 100% sure, but...
Best educated guess, it seems as though both murder weapons were weapons of opportunity from the apartment.
Yep. But what I'm thinking so far is, so this person ends up in Bill's apartment while Mary's there, no sign of forced entry, no struggle in the apartment, doesn't bring a weapon.
Well, doesn't bring a weapon that's used during the course of the murder.
Very true.
They could very well have you had a firearm,
yeah,
even if it wasn't loaded.
Just to use as like this threat of violence, yeah.
But if it was loaded, I mean, they went through the trouble of blocking off the curtains so nobody could see. People are going to hear the gunshot.
Very true, yeah. So maybe they were like, okay, well, I don't want to use this. I want to use something else. Let me see what I can find in the apartment.
Right.
That would make sense, okay.
And then I also think that, and I could be wrong on this, but if you have both Bill and Mary that were stabbed to death, it seems as though those would have been the original injuries. And then crushing of the skull is the killing blow. Strangling is the killing blow, for lack of a better term, on Bill.
Maybe.
Okay.
All right. So before we dive into those details, like with the autopsy, all that, I just want to cover physical evidence really quick, as there wasn't really all that much gathered, but there was one flub, I guess you could call it, in terms of collecting physical evidence. And I guess it was sort of later rectified. So originally, the Columbus PD were who took the call. They came in and their crime scene techs reviewed the apartment and attempted to collect any physical evidence that they may have been able to find. From what I gathered in reporting from the first few days after the two were killed, authorities were saying that they weren't able to locate very much physical evidence at all within the apartment, with one detective even originally stating, quote, "I don't think I've ever seen a case where we came up with so little after all this work," end quote. However, 3 or 4 days after the scene was originally reviewed, the Bureau of Criminal Identification brought in their techs to work the crime scene, and apparently this group had located bloody fingerprints that hadn't been located by the original techs who first reviewed the unit. And the prints that were found were said to be near the bed where Mary's body had been located, and there were even supposedly upwards of 20 partial and full prints that were missed by the original crime scene techs, that now the techs with the Bureau of Criminal Identification were able to find days later.
Which is strange because you have bloody fingerprints. It's not like you go and try and pull a fingerprint from like a windowsill because maybe they came in through the window or something like that.
Correct.
Like, these are bloody prints.
At least one set. I don't know about the other potential 20 that there might have been that were found, and who knows, who those belong to. But either way, it appeared to me at least that there must have been no indication that the original crime scene techs even attempted to get those other prints.
Or you can give them the benefit of the doubt because you do know that this is a very gruesome scene.
True.
And very similar to like the Idaho murders where there's blood everywhere. I mean, there could just be tons of blood and you miss where there's a little print.
Very true. It's definitely possible.
But it's good that this other team came in and they were able to locate them.
Definitely. And like John was saying, regardless of this whole mess up, they're able to come in, they're able to take these prints and then, be able to at least hold on to them and maybe use them in the future. And investigators were saying that they felt as though these prints were, quote, significant. But it's unclear, exactly how they felt as though they were significant, if they thought they belonged to the killer, or if there was something else about them that was, this big deal to authorities. So I don't know the answer or why they would say that, but it was something that authorities were putting out publicly, saying, these prints are significant. So now we're going to move on to the autopsy results and kind of discuss what was released to the public from those. So we'll start with Bill's. We know that he had been stabbed in the back, and it was clarified that he'd been stabbed 20 times. There were a handful of reports that also mentioned that Bill may have been hit in the head with the bowling ball, but then there were other comments that stated that he could have been kicked in the head by the killer, and then some other publications didn't even mention anything about him potentially being hit in the head at all. So that's something I'm not 100% sure on, but it does appear as though his cause of death was from the stab wounds. Now, an interesting detail regarding those wounds has to do with the ME, Deputy Coroner William Adrian, discovering that they were in sort of a pattern. Basically, according to reporting done by John A. Milton for the Cincinnati Post on this fact, the wounds were located in a pretty small area of Bill's back and were, quote, on either side of the victim's upper back, end quote. It was also stated that the pattern of where the wounds were was small enough and the stab wounds were all close enough together that you could essentially fit all of those wounds under your hand. Like if you were to place your hand over them, you wouldn't be able to see them anymore. The stab wounds were also described as being quite deep, but it's unclear exactly how deep in comparison to the 7.5-inch blade of the butcher knife that was used in the murders. Which, for me, begs the question, did the killer maybe cut himself in this attack due to the murder weapon used? Because if so, you would hope that there could potentially be DNA found on the victims or the murder weapon. And John's,
or the rug.
Or the rug, and John's over here smirking at me as I'm mentioning this. But this, I think, kind of does go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that this was 1970. DNA technology wasn't a thing yet, but there's definitely the potential to be able to use and test that today. So who knows if the killer was like, shit, I cut myself. I
gotta wrap my hand in this rug.
I just need to take this. Yeah. Oh.
That's why I was smirking.
Oh, good point. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, I mean, we had talked again. Idaho murders are huge right now.
Yeah.
So you had a Kabar-style knife. You have, a hilt on that knife to stop your hand from sliding onto the blade. When you're talking a kitchen knife, I mean, if you're stabbing something and you hit a hard patch of something, your hand's going to slide right down there. Yep. He could have injured himself and needed to wrap his hand in something because he was gushing blood.
Yeah.
Picked up this rug, wrapped his hand in it, and even though it was, blood-soaked and the blood did match Mary, his could have been mixed in there too, and whatever they tested,
well, maybe he had the same blood type.
Could have had
Back in 70, it was just typing.
Yeah,
they didn't do DNA. They couldn't confirm that it was Mary's. They were just like, oh, it was the same type.
So maybe that's why he took the rug, not to try and hide evidence, but to triage his own wound, leaves the crime scene. The bleeding is now finally stopped when he's in that alleyway, so he just chucks the rug.
Yeah.
And that's why it was left behind, because he didn't use it as a way to hide evidence but really just used it as a way to treat his own wounds.
It's a very interesting point. It was not anything that popped into my mind, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Do you know what blood type Mary was?
I don't know.
Be interested to know if it was like a very popular blood type.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I'm not sure, though, unfortunately.
All right.
Now, something I feel like you're probably curious about has to do with the wire coat hangers that were used to restrain Bill. First of all, the coat hangers were found still fastened to Bill's body when he and Mary were located, and there are actually several photos that I found in the Columbus Dispatch that I wanted to send to you, John. So the first actually shows one of the murder weapons, which was the knife, alongside the wire coat hangers that were used. And there are also 2 additional photos included in this article that showed both Bill and Mary's bodies being brought out on the stretchers, obviously covered in blankets. But based on these pictures, you can see sort of how Bill's body was contorted, as it appears to me that they did not remove the coat hangers until Bill's body was at the coroner's office. So I'm going to send those to you now so you can take a look.
Mm-hmm. So in the image where Bill's being brought out, you would assume that those are his feet that are the higher portion of the stretcher. Yeah, and then you have that knife. It's a big kitchen knife, which is no hilt.
Nope.
All blade.
Mm-hmm.
And then the wire coat hangers, which
are what you probably would have expected. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So to continue on with the coat hangers, the ME noted that the wire hanger that was wrapped around Bill's neck was so tight that it could have strangled him. And I think that's where those comments regarding that he could have been stabbed and strangled came from. And I think the strangulation aspect may have been by the wire hangers, not manual or anything like that.
All right.
Also, the other hangers used on Bill's wrists and ankles were somehow attached to the one that was around his neck. And those were said to be incredibly tight as well. And according to an Associated Press piece in the Cincinnati Enquirer, the coat hangers were, quote, wrapped so tightly that detectives believe the assailant used pliers to twist them, end quote. And this was something that I wanted to bring up because so far, it appears as though all of these weapons that are being used in this crime came from Bill's apartment. You've got the knife, most likely the bowling ball, and the coat hangers.
And the crutch that was jammed into the bowling ball probably too.
Correct. But what about the pliers? It's not like the killer's going to just show up with pliers. Well, he probably found those too, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely could have found them. But also, if you think you have this high crime area, and if this is just some random ne'er-do-well browsing the area looking for a crime of opportunity, pliers could be something that they have on them. They're looking to break into a house. They're looking to break into a car, whatever.
Maybe.
It could be something that had been on their person to begin with. But, I mean, law of averages, if everything else came from this apartment, you would assume maybe that came from the apartment too.
Yeah.
But whereas some of these things would be right out in the open, you probably have to look for the pliers. I doubt they'd be on a table or something unless somebody was doing work in the apartment. You can't really rule anything out at this point with this case.
Yeah, but like everything is just so bizarre.
Yeah. Like everything's so bizarre. And also, I'd like to know how investigators deemed that these wire hangers were so tight that they were tightened with a pair of pliers.
I don't know. Like I'm looking at the picture of the coat hangers now to like look at the ends of it. Like maybe since some of the ends are like very, very, very close to the edge, there's bends in it. And I wonder if like you wouldn't have been able to get it that tight with your fingers with like that little amount of metal to work with.
I don't know. That looks like the portion of the hanger that was already tightly wound during the production of the hanger.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Look at some of these though. Like the one right in the middle that's all the way furthest down at the bottom. Like that is very bendy there. You would expect for the top of a metal hanger up at the very top there, you can see that there's a curved one right next to that little white piece of paper, like white tag. That looks like the top of the hanger to me, whereas down at the bottom, there's like a bunch of like grooves in it almost. Those are the pieces that I'm talking about that look like, how would you be able to get your fingers around that to wrap it tightly enough? That's what I think maybe the pliers were used on. I could be totally wrong. I'm not an expert in anything like this, but that's just like what comes into my head when I'm looking at this.
All right, where do we go from here?
Mary's autopsy results.
All right.
So as we knew with Bill, we also know that Mary had been stabbed in the back, and the amount of times was later clarified as being 16 stab wounds in total. She had also been hit in the head with the bowling ball, and her skull had been crushed, and the ME had stated that her cause of death could have been from either of the different types of wounds she had. So the bowling ball could have killed her or the stab wounds. It's unclear which was the exact cause because both would have been fatal.
Okay. So going back to what I had mentioned earlier where, maybe the bowling ball was the killing strike and the strangulation was the killing strike, knowing that the coat hangers were also around Bill's neck, that could have been during the process of hog-tying him as a potential means to kill him. And then the stabbing was the final blow. And then in Mary's case, she could have been struck in the head to be knocked unconscious. And then the stabbing was the killing blow there.
Possible, yeah. I mean, I don't know, though, because you're thinking a crushed skull. You would probably not just be unconscious from that.
I don't know.
Who knows?
You'd have to know the extent of it, but
yeah.
Regardless, either way, I think it's 50-50 one way, 50-50 the other way.
Agreed. So. Fingernail scrapings were also taken from both Mary and Bill, and this was, I believe, another reason why investigators felt as though there was no struggle on the victims' parts, because there was nothing out of the ordinary found beneath their nails. And something else the ME noted in the findings for Mary's autopsy had to do with markings on her wrists and ankles. We know Bill had been restrained, but it was a bit unclear regarding if Mary had been. In early reporting on this case, there were some publications that said Mary had been bound, also with coat hangers. Others stated she'd been bound with another type of object, and then there were some, again, that didn't say anything about it at all. But once the autopsy was completed, it seemed to be further clarified that Mary had not been found with restraints still on her, but that she had been restrained during the attack. And what was used were those same wire coat hangers that were later used on Bill. And the ME noted that they were likely the same coat hangers used on both of them because Mary's hair was found in the hangers when they were reviewed and taken off of Bill's body.
Wow. I wouldn't have thought that. I would have thought that Bill had to have been bound ahead of time to allow this killer to do to Mary whatever he was going to do.
I thought the same thing. So when I heard that, one of two things popped into my head. One being that... Well, I guess I can't really say that because I know more than you do, so
but what was your reaction when you found out that piece of info?
I found out that piece of info after I already knew something else, but it made me think, first of all, how the heck could this have been done without more than one person? That was the initial thought. Yep. But one of the main things that was reported in the early days on this case was that authorities couldn't, quote, put the scene together. And I think this goes along with this conversation that we're having right now, John, where it's how could this happen outside of more than one person? It seemed like authorities didn't really seem to believe that it was more than one person. So first of all, authorities were thinking that the perpetrator would have had to use the restraints one person at a time. That seems pretty clear, especially considering the hair, what the ME said. And something else that they couldn't determine about the scene was if this attack was already underway and one of the respective victims walked in on it. So say Bill had left the apartment for some reason that night. Say maybe he was just going to pick up a pizza or something. And Mary was like, oh, I'll stay here. And, I'll see you when you get back. Maybe that's when this transpired. Mary was attacked first and then Bill walks in. And maybe she's already deceased, and then he's just a subsequent victim.
That makes sense. Could be a reason why maybe the door was left unlocked.
Yes.
If Bill was just running out for a quick thing, maybe he didn't think to lock the door. But also, I mean, I'm trying to work through this in my head, and I'm saying, in what way could Bill be present in that room while Mary is bound by these coat hangers, and this person is in there trying to kill her or sexually assault her? He just, allows that to happen, and then the coat hangers are taken from Mary and used on Bill. It just doesn't make sense.
Unless this guy had a gun and was, pointing it at him. I don't think that that's the case, but the only other thing that would come into my mind is two people.
Right. It has to be two people.
Or more than two people, just more than one person.
Right. It has to be more than one person, or, like you were just saying, Mary was being attacked first, then Bill comes in after the fact because maybe he was out of the apartment for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes sense that either Bill was not in there at the time where Mary was first attacked.
Yep.
Or there were multiple people there during the time of their murders. Because Bill is the one with the bindings left on him.
Correct. So you would think that he is the one who is
He was killed
last.
second.
Yes.
Right.
And I feel like we're sitting here contemplating this the exact same way authorities were. And I think that's why they were saying, we just cannot put the scene together. Like, we can't figure out how this happened.
No, and I mean, they also said that they couldn't tell if Bill had been struck in the head.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe the murder's taking place with Mary, and then Bill comes in, and this guy picks up the bowling ball that's on, this stick, for lack of a better term, and whacks him with it and knocks him unconscious.
Yeah,
and by
maybe.
the time he wakes up, the bindings have been taken off of Mary and put on him.
Maybe that too, then. Maybe it was just they struck Bill in some way and he ended up unconscious and couldn't do anything to then either try and help or save Mary or help or save himself because he was unconscious.
Yeah.
That would make sense too.
Jeez, this is going to be a case that it upsets me because I feel like we're going to have like so many questions, and it's such a terrible way for somebody to be murdered. Obviously, you don't want anybody to be killed, but like this is just so gruesome, and that they were, this loving couple, and they both died in the apartment together at some point.
It's so sad, and I feel like, I don't tend to cover cases that are like incredibly gruesome or graphic or things like that, and I feel like the last one I did was Michael Kleiman, and I feel like I need to like give myself a minute between cases. Like, as much as there are other cases that are brutal, this just feels like this next level of brutality, and like, this is a sick fuck that did this. Like, this is messed up.
Right. Either a sick fuck or somebody that just has no regard for anybody.
Yeah.
What that kind of made me think? Not how terrible this is, but how you normally don't cover cases like this, and now you're going to need a breather after it because it's just so terrible. Makes me think of the B&B murder podcast.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of them, but they're called True Crime B&B, and they had reached out to us a couple weeks ago. They're really, really nice. And basically they tell a true crime story. The mom or daughter does. And then the other one, whichever week they're on, will tell like a heartwarming story. Yeah, like something to like lift your spirits afterwards. And I was like, wow, I wish I thought of that. That's a really good idea. And I feel like it's definitely true in this, true crime space where
it's always doom and gloom. It's always bad.
Yeah. Like, we're recording this right now a couple weeks before the episode's coming out. But I told John, like, I think I need a break tomorrow.
Right.
I think I need to, I've been knee deep in this case for a solid like 5 or 6 days now. And I want a day of playing Cozy Grove and doing nothing just to make my brain happy again. Because woof, this one's tough.
Right.
But all right, let's get back to Mary's autopsy. One of the most confusing aspects of her autopsy findings had to do with whether she had been sexually assaulted or not. Countless publications reported different findings, that she had been, that she hadn't been, or that a sexual assault had been attempted. But for decades, there really hasn't been any sort of concrete answer on this fact. But from what I've gathered, it appears as though Mary had been found with most of her clothing still on her body. And I tend to think this is relatively true due to a couple comments made regarding the fact that her shirt had been found still tucked into the skirt she was found wearing when authorities reviewed her body at the scene. However, there were other comments stating that Mary was nude from the waist down. We had talked about that earlier. So I do wonder if maybe it was her undergarments that were removed, and maybe that's what that comment was regarding. But either way, even though the findings appeared to be inconclusive, authorities did later somewhat clarify that at the end of the day, they pretty much believed that whoever did this at least attempted to sexually assault Mary. But based on the inconclusiveness of the report, I kind of tend to think that maybe the perpetrator did not succeed in their efforts. And I wonder if this was the point in which Bill walked in. And due to this whole situation regarding the potential of a sexual assault or not, and it being believed at, the very least that it was an attempted sexual assault, Lieutenant Ruddock stated, quote, "We're still working on the assumption that the motive for the crime was a sexual attack," end quote.
Which is something I was thinking about and was going to bring up, is that if investigators believed that this was, sexually motivated, it would make sense that maybe Bill had left the room. This person barges in, they attempt to sexually assault her, then Bill comes in, and things kind of just unravel from there.
Yeah.
And maybe this wasn't going to be a murder to begin with. But because now they were outed and Bill saw them, and knew what was going on, they just went with it and they ended up killing them both. That way there were no witnesses to it.
Yeah. Now, authorities and the ME did appear to be able to narrow down the time of death for both Mary and Bill. Originally, it was said to be sometime between 6 p.m. and midnight, but based on additional information authorities were able to garner in their initial investigation, that time frame was actually dwindled down even further to between 7:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. And the first reason they were able to narrow down this time frame actually had to do with a phone call Mary made from within Bill's apartment. It was reported that she called a girl who attended OSU that was a friend of hers at around 7:30 p.m. And I don't know the full details regarding what this call was about, but what I do know kind of makes me question the reporting on it a little bit. So based on what I was able to find, it was mentioned that Mary called this friend to let her know that she would be heading over to her place later that night to spend the night there. Yet we know that Mary had already gotten this hotel room at the Holiday Inn, so that really didn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe misreporting, maybe someone's confused, I don't really know.
Maybe by Mary saying that she was heading over to her place, maybe it was just like written poorly and she was heading back to her apartment.
Maybe, yeah,
her
that's
place,
also
like
possible
Mary's
too.
place, not her,
not the
person
friend's
that
place.
She called place, because if she's at OSU, I don't know, maybe she's like, oh, I'm going back to my apartment later. Do you want to come over that way?
Maybe, but I also saw some reporting that said like this was a good friend of hers at the college. Like obviously, you know, she and Bill would go back and forth between their two respective universities. And I think she would spend time with this friend often. So I don't know if it was like maybe they misconstrued the weekend that, you know, she was supposed to stay over there, or maybe the whole thing regarding the hotel is wrong. But I tend to think like that was reported a lot. So I tend to think that it's accurate, but I just really don't know. And that's the thing that's hard with these older unsolved cases. You know, a lot of times you find that there's misreporting in the beginning.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're just kind of putting out whatever. And then as they, you know, get their bearings and the investigation is really underway and they have more witness statements and things like that, things start to come into focus a bit more. But like when cases like this, there's a flurry in the beginning and then it just dwindles and there's like barely anything for decades.
Yeah.
Do you believe what was originally put out?
I mean, if
kind of, but...
Well, hear me out. If you had traveled to wherever to see a significant other, but you weren't going to stay with them over the night, you had a hotel stay, but then this other friend that's also from the area calls you and they're like, oh, hey, you want to do something? Like, even though you have a hotel, you may
Yeah,
want to
I might just ditch the hotel, yeah.
I mean, so...
Yeah, that would make sense too. Who knows? I mean, she's 20.
Right.
20-year-olds are just doing whatever. I mean, obviously, she was very responsible. She was very religious. She was dedicated to her studies, but that doesn't mean that she's not a 20-year-old either and wants to hang out with her friends and screw the hotel, whatever.
Exactly.
Makes sense. All right, so regardless of what Mary and this girl discussed, it does appear as though this phone call was made from within Bill's apartment, and authorities concluded, based on that, that Mary and Bill had to still be alive around this 7:30 p.m. time frame. And another reason the time frame was shortened from midnight, like I said before, down to 10 p.m. has to do with some witness statements. So we're going to move on to that category of the investigation now so I can kind of clarify that piece of things for you. But just for context, from what I can tell, on the night of the 27th, no one else was in their apartments within this building. It was just Bill and Mary.
So it was totally vacant. The whole apartment building was vacant.
That night, yes. There was a married couple that lived on the first floor, and there were at least a few other people that lived within apartments on the second and third floors, but none of those people were home. Okay. Literally just Bill and Mary. So back to the witness statement that helped to narrow down the timeline. It has to do with someone that noticed the door to Bill's apartment was open, and that person said they saw the door open around 10 p.m. that night. Now, yet again, based on what we just said, this feels like another discrepancy in reporting because...
If nobody's home, how does anybody see it?
Exactly. The only thing that kind of came into my head was maybe someone just stopped off at home. This is a college town. 10 p.m. isn't really that late. Maybe they were like, oh shit, I forgot my whatever, and like ran into their apartment to get it. And they just saw that the door was open and then they headed out.
Yeah, either that or maybe they weren't home during the time period of 7:30 to 10 p.m. They get home at 10 p.m. and they're like, oh, the door's open. Notice it when they're going in. I understand how they reported that nobody was home that night. Maybe they're referencing nobody was home that night during the time period of 7:30 to 10 p.m.
That would make sense too. Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Because it just doesn't make sense that nobody would be home for the entire time. Like,
yeah,
no, they're out during that period and then they came home. But it is a Friday night, so people are probably out, maybe going out to dinner, partying, whatever.
Yeah, thinking like a married couple too. Like, are they just out like partying and like crashing at somebody's house?
Right.
Maybe not. But either way, based on this fact, authorities felt as though if the door was open at 10 p.m., that Bill and Mary had likely already been deceased by this point.
Makes sense.
Makes sense to me too. Now, keeping with the witness statements, let's review the ones that authorities received that were at least reported on, because of course, I'm sure there were witness statements that came in that the public was never made aware of. But authorities had spoken with dozens of people within the first week, and details regarding several of the statements were released to the public. So, we'll begin with the cab driver. He was said to be the very last person to see Mary Petry alive the night of the 27th. He'd picked her up, assumably at the Holiday Inn, and dropped her off in front of 178.5 West 8th Ave at approximately 6 p.m. From how I understand it, the cab driver waited and watched to make sure Mary made it inside the building safely, and then he drove off. And authorities interviewed this cab driver, they confirmed his story, and after their conversation with him, they put out publicly that he'd been, quote, completely exonerated, end quote.
Yeah, I mean, you know that it's a college area, college town, high crime rate. This is just probably a cab driver doing this young girl a solid, knowing that she could easily be taken advantage of in this area.
100%. Makes perfect sense to me. Now, residents within a 4-block radius of the location where the murder took place were also all interviewed during the weekend of the 28th, as that was where authorities' efforts focused in the first 2 days. So they were just canvassing, they were searching, and they were talking to people in this 4-block radius. So authorities told the Cincinnati Enquirer, quote, "We do have some leads. We're checking some particular people we have files on who might be capable of this kind of offense, people who frequent the campus area," end quote. But for the most part, everyone that investigators were able to talk to stated they did not hear or see anything strange at all that night. And I think this goes back to something that John and I were just discussing a few minutes ago in regards to the fact that at least we know that Bill had been gagged. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, that's going to muffle any sounds. So with no people in the building, and then, to see if sound is going to travel that far to neighbors, probably not.
I mean, also something else to think about, too, is that Bill was gagged, but he was also bound, and investigators believe that Mary was bound with those same restraints previously. So I think it's fair to assume that Mary could have been bound and gagged as well.
I was just going to say the same thing. Yep.
Right, and then everything was taken from her and put onto Bill.
Yep, I think that makes sense. Then, at some point later on, a girl came forward to tell police about an incident she'd experienced that same weekend, and I can't quite tell if it was on the Friday night when the murders happened or if it was on the Saturday, but either way, regardless of the specific day, she stated that a man attempted to get into her apartment, but she was able to fight him off, and he wasn't able to gain entry. And when she was asked to describe this man, she stated he was, quote, about 20 years old, tall and heavyset, end quote. But it does seem to me that authorities ruled out a connection between this attempted break-in and Bill and Mary's murders, and I just have this feeling that it has to do with, forced entry. If he's, trying to force his way in, what other reason?
That can be totally misconstrued, too, though, because if I'm trying to force my way in just after you opened and, got into your apartment, right, and you,
true.
shut the door in my face,
yeah,
right, I'm trying to force my way into the apartment, or if I knock on your door and you answer it, and I'm trying to push myself into the apartment, that's me trying to force my way in.
Yeah.
So forcing your way into an apartment doesn't necessarily, I think, to me anyway, mean forced entry.
Yeah.
Like breaking down a door.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. But then there's one more witness statement that I want to discuss, and I feel like, at least to me, it's one of the most compelling of the bunch. So, according to a piece written by John Ewing for The Lantern, again, OSU's student newspaper, a newspaper delivery boy came forward and provided a statement to police about something that he'd witnessed the night of the murders. Why he was delivering papers at night is completely beyond me.
I think you're reading too much into that one.
What?
He's a paper delivery boy, maybe that's his profession at the time or something like that, but I don't think he's delivering at that point.
He was.
He was delivering papers at that point?
Yes. If you listen to the rest of my story, I would have told you that he went in to go deliver a paper.
Okay, I would have assumed that he was a delivery guy, but he was just in the area at the time.
No, and he's a kid. He was a little boy.
Wow.
I don't know how old. He, was definitely not a teenager.
Okay, continue.
So
my bad.
Yeah. So he said that he came up to 178.5 West 8th Ave, Bill and Thomas's apartment, or at least apartment building, on that Friday night that Bill and Mary were killed. And he arrived there around 8 p.m. Again, 8 p.m. delivering papers is just so bizarre to me, but okay. So
is this he's delivering the student newspaper or he's delivering actual newspapers?
Not sure.
Okay, I'm wondering if the student newspaper, they just put it out and it's like a weekend newspaper or something like that and they put it out.
Maybe that could be a good reason.
That's all
but
nonsense, but.
So the boy went inside and delivered a paper to whoever in the building had like a delivery service set up for the newspaper. And as this boy was leaving the building, he said he saw a man on the front porch that he'd supposedly never seen before, or that he'd at least never seen at that location before. And the boy said that as he was leaving, that man he saw on the porch said to him, quote, "Get the hell out of here," end quote.
Jeez.
A little aggressive.
A little aggressive, especially for a resident that lived there. And if this kid comes by all the time delivering the papers to whoever has a paper subscription, it's like, who the hell are you to yell at my paper boy? You know what I mean?
But is he a resident?
Probably not.
No. So before I dive into my opinions on this, I do actually, John, I didn't send this to you yet and I wanted to, but just a picture of what the house looked like.
I was going to ask that because when you said the front porch, I did not picture this being a place with a front porch. I pictured like this big apartment building with like multiple units.
Yeah, no. So they were older houses that were converted.
Oh,
so there's two pictures
not what I thought
here.
at all.
Yeah. So the first picture that I sent you, which again, everyone, all the pictures that we ever reference in our episodes are on our socials or our website. So the first picture that I sent to John is the photo of the house, like pretty much face on in 1970. And then the next picture is of it in 2019. And it literally looks like exactly the same. It's like nothing of this house has changed, but it's in color too. So that's a little more helpful, but
yeah, this totally changes my whole feeling on the case. Not like,
damn it, I am so sorry, everyone. I should have said this to John earlier.
Not like, how this happened or why it happened or anything like that, but like, this is a house.
This is a house.
This is not like a brick, high-rise apartment building.
Well, this is what the apartment building looked like.
So there's only one main entrance?
That's what it seems like. Yeah, the newspaper boy would have had to go right up the porch to get in there and to get out of there.
Unless there's a back door that leads to a staircase that can get you into either the base level apartment and then the second floor apartments after that.
Well,
but
yeah,
this looks like
ingress and egress, so
right.
Maybe.
This looks like, an Airbnb that you'd share with somebody, not like an apartment building.
Yeah, but you can see in the front there, too. I don't know which bedroom was whose, but that obviously looks like the second floor, and the two bedrooms faced the street in Bill and Thomas's apartment. So anybody really could have seen right into there. So I can see why the killer would have blocked off the curtains to make sure that no one could see anything. There wasn't even like a sliver. But anyway, back to this whole guy yelling at the kid to get the hell out of here. So, of course, this seems like a major lead. And you would think could be helpful in coming up with even a sketch of this guy. And then hopefully from that sketch, authorities could find him. They could question him. Even if he had nothing to do with the murders, at least they could rule him out, right?
Yes. And I just want to mention one thing before you continue on. First off, just because it's in my head, I assume this was not a 20-year-old heavyset male that the kid described.
I don't think so.
Okay. But also, if a murder is taking place in here, whoever murdered Bill and Mary had to know that nobody else was in here. Because I'm thinking, you go into an apartment building, you got a whole line of apartment doors that you're going into and stuff like that. No, this is just a house that's converted into apartments. Who knows how it looked inside, but you got to know that this place is empty to do this safely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wild.
But also,
it makes it
what
even
are the
more
odds?
bizarre.
Yes.
Right, but knowing what this looks like now, it makes it even more bizarre that this happened. Because they had to know that everybody else was gone.
But then, what are the odds of knowing that everybody else is gone? And what are the odds that night, Bill
Mary's
and Mary
there.
are there and Mary's there? So that's the other thing, too. Bill was supposed to go to frickin' Cincinnati.
Right.
Mary was not supposed to come to Columbus. So then it makes me think, was this someone they knew or was this a completely random attack?
Was it someone that lived there?
I don't know. They said that everybody was gone.
I don't know.
Who knows?
I mean, people could have rock solid alibis from the looks of it, but it could turn out that they're not.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
So it was reported in that same piece that the kid that was delivering the newspapers was not able to describe pretty much any of this guy's appearance. And
if he's a young kid, he might have been scared when the guy's like, get the hell out of here.
Yeah, absolutely. And who knows how soon after this happened that they talked to this kid and, it makes sense. I get it. He's young, but he was able to say that the guy looked young. That was like the one thing that he was able to give. So I would assume Young would be like college age.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes me wonder like how investigators ruled out this other 20-year-old heavyset person that tried to force his way into some girl's apartment so quickly, because you don't know if this is the same description. If he just says that he's young could be 20 years old. Was he heavyset? Oh, I don't remember. Okay, I mean, it could be the same person.
Just you wait, because it's going to get even more confusing.
Oh boy, I was confused already.
And I also just want to mention, before we move on, that the time frame that this kid is saying that he saw this guy was at 8 p.m.
Matches perfectly with the time of death.
Smack dab in the middle of the time frame. Well, I guess more towards the earlier part of the time frame, but either way, it's within the time frame. Mary made the call at 7:30. I mean, 8 p.m. tracks. It all tracks to me. So, I just think it's unfortunate that he wasn't able to give any additional details. I do wonder if maybe authorities did do what you said, John, and they were like, oh, was he heavyset? Did he look like this? Did he look like that? What did his hair look like? But then you just have to think like maybe they couldn't really take anything that he was saying as fact because he is young and because he couldn't remember, and say however long it took for them to talk to him or for him to come forward or something. Like, it could just be like, oh, we're putting out this information about this guy, but it could all just be completely wrong. And then you could end up getting someone, in trouble for something that they didn't do based on this kid's statement. So I think it just
I think
could
that
cause a mess.
I agree. I think that one tactic that investigators could have used where, you said that this kid didn't recognize this person, but wasn't able to provide a description. Well, I mean, you could do a show up and you could say, hey, I'm going to bring this kid by and look at all these people that live here. Are any of these people the person that you saw?
Yeah.
That could have been done, and maybe it just was inconclusive, and maybe it wasn't documented publicly, and we don't know that.
Very, very true, and very possible. So I think with that witness piece out of the way, now is a good place to pause our conversation. Next episode, as we continue on with this story, we'll kick things off with some of the other crimes that were taking place in the area around that time, analyze the type of person that authorities believed could have committed these atrocities, and discuss the theories surrounding the case. So make sure to tune in next week, where you'll hear all that and more in part 2 of the murders of William Sproat and Mary Petry. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.